Have you ever thought that your own child, the child you gave birth to and raised with all your heart, would be the one to frame you, fabricate evidence to ruin your reputation, and try to imprison you just to steal the fortune you built over 40 years? That's exactly what happened to Nathan Caldwell, a retired federal judge who presided over thousands of cases, yet failed to see the trap his own son had set. Please like, comment with the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. I still remember the exact sound my coffee mug made when I set it down on the kitchen counter that Tuesday morning. A hollow ceramic click against the granite, the kind of small sound that somehow feels too loud when a house has been empty for too long. 2 years. That was how long it had been since I'd spoken to my son Ethan. Not a phone call, not a text message, not even a birthday card slipped under the door. 2 years of absolute silence, so complete and so deliberate that I'd stopped expecting anything to break it. I was 68 years old, retired from the federal bench after 31 years of service, and I lived alone in a 2-bedroom condominium on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Richmond, Virginia. It wasn't the life I'd imagined for myself at this age. The life I'd imagined had a son in it, maybe grandchildren someday. Sunday dinners, noise, the particular kind of chaos that comes with family. Instead, I had silence and a coffee that was getting cold. So when my phone buzzed that morning and I looked down and saw Ethan's name on the screen for the first time in 24 months, my hand actually shook. I sat there for a full 10 seconds just staring at it. My thumb hovered over the screen. I am not a man who hesitates easily. 3 decades of judicial decision-making teaches you to cut through uncertainty and act. But in that moment, I could not make myself open the message, because as long as I hadn't read it, it could still be anything. It could be the thing I'd been waiting for. Then I opened it. Dad, I've been doing a lot of thinking. I'd like to sit down with you, properly, face to face. Vanessa and I are hosting a small dinner at the house this Saturday. Nothing formal, just family. I hope you'll come. There's a lot I want to say. I read it 3 times. Just family. The house he was referring to was the Caldwell estate, 4.7 acres of property in Hanover County that I had purchased 32 years ago, built a home on with my own savings, and later transferred into Ethan and Vanessa's names as a wedding gift when they married 8 years back. It had been a gesture of faith, of love, of the kind of optimism that fathers have when they watch their children start their lives and want to give them every possible advantage. I'd been a fool, as it turned out. But I didn't know that yet. Not fully. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window and looked out over the city. October light was falling across the rooftops in long gold sheets, the kind of light that makes everything look temporary. I thought about what Ethan's message meant. I thought about Vanessa. Her precise smile, her calculated warmth, the way she had always looked at me like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I thought about the last time I'd seen them both, at a dinner that had ended with raised voices and a door slammed so hard the picture frames rattled. I thought about how badly I wanted this to be real. And I wrote back, I'll be there. Saturday at 7. Marat. What I knew about my daughter-in-law, Vanessa Cross, and I will be honest, because honesty is the only thing I have left to give this story, was that she was the most strategically intelligent person I had ever encountered outside of a courtroom. She had grown up poor in a small town in western North Carolina, the daughter of a county clerk and a woman who cleaned vacation homes for wealthy families in the mountains. She had climbed out of that life through sheer will and tactical intelligence, earning a full scholarship to Duke, then a law degree from Georgetown, then a position at one of Richmond's most aggressive civil litigation firms. By the time Ethan brought her home to meet me, she was 31 years old, earning more money than I had made in my first decade on the bench. And she looked at my son with the expression of a woman who had very carefully selected exactly the life she intended to have. I don't want to suggest I disliked her immediately. That's not true. I admired her, actually. I recognized something in her drive that I understood. I had come from modest means myself, had worked my way up through public service and discipline and sacrifice. We should have understood each other. But there was always something underneath Vanessa's surface that made me uneasy. A quality that I couldn't name at first, and that Ethan dismissed as me being overprotective, overcritical, the typical difficult father-in-law who could never accept that his son had grown up. Maybe he was right. I turned that possibility over in my mind for years. What I know now is that what I was sensing all along was the absence of something, the absence of genuine warmth, of actual love, of the ordinary human messiness of caring about another person without an agenda underneath it. Vanessa operated on calculation. Every decision she made, from the clothes she wore to the friends she cultivated to the way she timed her silences in conversation, was strategic. She was, at her core, a chess player. And Ethan, my brilliant, funny, emotionally impulsive son, who had never quite figured out how to want things that were good for him, had become her most important piece. The estrangement 2 years ago had started simply enough. I had expressed concern during a dinner that started pleasantly and deteriorated into something unrecognizable about certain financial decisions Ethan had mentioned in passing. He'd been talking about a business venture, a real estate development partnership with 2 other investors, none of whom I'd heard of, that required him to leverage a significant portion of the estate property as collateral. I hadn't meant to push. I'd simply ask questions. That's what I do. It's what 30 years as a judge trained me to do, to probe the foundation of an argument, to ask the question underneath the question. But Vanessa had taken my questions as an attack, and Ethan, who had always chosen her side when she was in the room, had exploded. You've never trusted her. You've never once accepted that she is my wife and this is our life and our money and our decisions to make. You think just because you wore a robe for 30 years, you get to sit in judgment on everyone around you. You don't, Dad. Not anymore. The door slammed. The long silence. The 2 years of nothing. I had called twice in the first 6 months, left messages that were not returned. After that, I stopped. Not because I stopped caring. I never stopped caring, not for a single day. But because I had reached the age at which a man must accept certain painful truths about what he cannot control. And one of them is that you cannot love someone back toward you if they have decided to walk away. And yet here was the message. Just family. I spent the rest of that week trying to talk myself into calm. I cleaned the apartment. I drove out to the cemetery where my wife Patricia had been buried 11 years earlier and sat beside her grave for an hour in the October cold and talked to her the way I still did sometimes when I needed to think out loud. She had always been the wiser one between us, quieter, more patient, quicker to forgive. She had loved Ethan with a fierceness that had no room for disappointment. She would have told me to go to the dinner. She would have said, "Nathan, he's reaching out. Whatever it takes, you go." So I went. Saturday evening arrived gray and cold. I dressed carefully, not in a suit, which might seem formal and defensive, but in a dark sweater and good trousers, the clothes of a man who is trying without appearing to try. I drove the 40 minutes to Hanover County with the radio off, rehearsing nothing in particular, just breathing. The Caldwell estate sat at the end of a long private drive lined with oak trees that I had planted myself the year we bought the property. They were full grown now, massive and overarching, their branches stripped bare for fall and reaching across the gravel in skeletal patterns in the headlights of my car. I had always loved this driveway. There had been years when driving down it felt like coming home in the truest sense of the word. That evening, driving down it felt like something else. I couldn't name it. A pressure in my chest, a low-grade wrongness that I couldn't locate. I pulled to a stop about 200 feet from the house and sat for a moment with the engine idling. The lights were on inside, warm yellow light spilling from the dining room windows. I could see the shape of the table through the glass. There appeared to be place settings for several people. Nothing formal, just family. I was about to pull forward when the side door of the house, the door that opened from the kitchen onto the narrow service path between the house and the detached garage, burst open, and Marisol Vega came running. Marisol had worked at the estate for 14 years. She had started as a twice-weekly housekeeper when Patricia was still alive and had stayed on after my wife's death, keeping the house in order through the succession of tenants before Ethan and Vanessa moved in. She was 53 years old, a compact, no-nonsense woman from Oaxaca who had raised 4 children in this country on her own after her husband's death, and who possessed, in my experience, an almost preternatural ability to read a room. Patricia had trusted her completely. I trusted her completely. She was one of perhaps 8 or 10 people on this earth whose judgment I would accept without question. She was running toward my car in the dark. Not walking quickly, running. Her coat wasn't buttoned. She'd clearly come out without planning to come out, grabbed whatever was nearest, and come straight through the kitchen door the moment she saw my headlights on the driveway. I put the car in park and rolled down the window. Marisol. Mr. Caldwell. She reached the car door, grabbed the frame with both hands. She was breathing hard. Her face in the faint glow of the dashboard was stripped of its usual composure. The expression of a woman who had overridden something, had pushed past some internal hesitation, and come out here because what she knew was more important than her fear. Don't go in, please. Don't ring the bell. Don't knock. Don't go near that front door tonight. I looked at her. What's happening? They called the police. Her voice dropped even lower. Before you arrived. They called and told them you'd been harassing them, threatening them, that you'd been making threats, that they were afraid of what you might do when you came tonight. She pressed her hands harder against the car door. I heard the whole call, Mr. Caldwell. Vanessa made it herself from the kitchen. I was just on the other side of the door. She didn't know. The world went very quiet. I heard myself say that again. They're going to have you arrested when you ring that bell. Her eyes were bright and terrified and completely certain. The patrol car is already on the way. Maybe 2 minutes, maybe less. The dinner, the invitation, it's not real. None of it is real. They needed you to come here tonight, to this address, so that when the police arrived you'd be standing right there and there would be nothing you could say. Please. She took a breath. Please, you have to go, or hide, or I don't know, but you cannot ring that bell. 2 minutes. I am a man who spent 31 years making decisions under pressure. I am a man who has seen the full spectrum of what human beings are capable of doing to one another in the name of money and fear and desperation. I thought I was past being surprised by any of it. I was wrong. But I was not paralyzed. Even in that moment, even with that particular cold, nauseating, world-tilting, specific horror of understanding that your own child has planned to have you arrested, I was not paralyzed, because I had been trained over decades to remain functional in catastrophe. You go quiet inside, you go very still, and you think. Get back inside, I told Marisol. Go in through the kitchen. Don't let them know you came out here. But go. I'm going to be all right. But you need to be inside before that patrol car turns up the drive. Can you do that? She looked at me for 2 long seconds. Then she nodded. Once. Hard. I'll be in touch, she said, and she turned and ran back. I put the car in reverse and pulled back into the shadows of the oak trees, cutting my headlights. 30 seconds later, I was parked on the gravel shoulder of the driveway, completely dark, completely still, invisible from the house. I sat there in the dark, and I waited. The patrol car arrived in 4 minutes. I watched the blue and white lights wash through the naked branches of the trees as it came down the drive. I watched it park in front of the house. I watched 2 officers climb out and walk to the front door. I watched Ethan open that door. Even at 200 feet with only the porch light and the wash of the police car's headlights to see by, I could make out my son's face clearly enough. He was wearing a blue shirt I didn't recognize. His posture was the specific posture of a man performing distress. Shoulders slightly curved, head tilted, hands moving in the particular expressive gestures of someone describing something frightening. And next to him, just inside the doorway, behind his left shoulder, precisely positioned to be seen without appearing to step forward, was Vanessa, watching, calm, with an expression that I could not read from this distance but that I understood in my gut, with a certainty that went beyond anything I could have articulated at that moment. This was going exactly as she had planned it. The officers spent several minutes on the porch. One of them made a call. The other appeared to take notes. Then they walked back to the car, spoke briefly to each other, and drove back up toward the road. Not with the urgency of responding to an active threat, but with the settled, methodical pace of officers who had confirmed a complaint and logged a report and would be filing something in the morning. Filing something. About me. I sat in the dark for a long time after the patrol car disappeared. Long enough for the lights in the dining room to flicker once, twice, then go still. Long enough for the cold to creep in through the vents. Long enough for the first wave of something that was not grief and not rage, but some compound of both, something older and heavier, to move through me and settle somewhere beneath my ribs where I suspected it would live for quite some time. Then I took out my phone and I called my attorney. Her name was Diane Okafor, and she had been my personal lawyer for 19 years. She picked up on the third ring, which told me she'd been awake, which was not unusual for Diane. She was 55 years old, a former assistant U.S. attorney who had moved into private practice a decade ago, and she was the most relentlessly prepared human being I had ever known. She had the particular quality of mind that I had always valued above intelligence alone. She could hold complexity without flinching. She could look at a bad situation and ask the next question instead of reacting to the current one. Nathan, her voice was careful, the way it got when she knew something was coming. It's 11:30 on a Saturday. I know, I said. I need to tell you something. And I told her everything. Sitting in the dark at the end of my own driveway, 200 feet from the house I had built with my own hands and gifted to a son who had just tried to have me arrested, I told Diane Okafor every single detail. Marisol's warning, the police car, Ethan's performance on the porch, Vanessa's positioning. When I finished, there was silence on the line. Nathan, Diane said finally, do not go home tonight without texting me the address of wherever you end up. And don't contact Ethan or Vanessa. Not a message, not a call, not an email, nothing. Do you understand? I understand. I'll start making calls in the morning. Another pause. How are you? I looked through the windshield at the dark shape of the house at the end of the drive. The house where my wife and I had raised our son. The house where Patricia had died in a bed upstairs with morning light coming through the curtains, and Ethan holding her hand on one side and me holding it on the other. The house I had given away out of love, and that had been used tonight as the set dressing for a trap. I've had better evenings, I said. I drove to a hotel that night, a mid-range place off I-95 where I paid cash and gave my name at the front desk and sat on the edge of a standard king bed in a room that smelled of industrial cleaning products, and I did not sleep for a very long time. I have been accused, in the years since all of this happened, of being too controlled in a crisis. My former clerk used to say I had the emotional responses of a man with very good insurance, calm in the immediate aftermath, quietly devastating in the long term. There's some truth to that. I don't break down easily, I don't come apart. But I want to be clear about what that night actually felt like, because I think people hear controlled and imagine unaffected, and those are not the same thing. What I felt sitting on that hotel bed at 1 a.m. with the sounds of the interstate filtering through the curtain was a specific and terrible kind of grief. Not the grief of losing someone to accident or illness. Those griefs are awful, but they are clean in a way. There is no decision in them. The person you lost did not choose to leave. This was the other kind, the kind where someone looks at you, someone who knows exactly what you are, who has sat across from you at 1,000 tables, who you have driven to school and coached through heartbreak and held in your arms when they were small and sick and frightened, and makes a decision, a deliberate, calculated, fully considered decision to hurt you, to not only hurt you, but to destroy you, to use every tool available to dismantle your reputation, your freedom, your life. My son had invited me to dinner so that police could arrest me on his doorstep. I turned that fact over in my mind all night the way you turn a stone, looking for an angle that makes it smaller, less true. There wasn't one. By 4 a.m, I had stopped trying to make it smaller and started asking the more useful question, why now? Because if Vanessa had planned this, and it was Vanessa's planning, I was certain of that. Whatever Ethan's level of willing participation, she had planned it for a reason. The dinner invitation hadn't come from nowhere. 2 years of silence followed by a specific invitation to a specific location on a specific evening wasn't reconciliation. It was logistics. What did they need? I thought about the business venture Ethan had mentioned 2 years ago, before the estrangement, the real estate development, the investors I'd never heard of, the plan to leverage the estate as collateral. I thought about the conversation I'd had 3 months ago with a former colleague whose son worked in real estate law. A casual mention, over lunch, that there had been some contentious filings around a Hanover County property. I hadn't paid it particular attention at the time. I was paying attention to it now. What if the venture had failed? What if there was debt? Serious debt. The kind that threatened the estate? And what if the solution in Vanessa's architecture was not to manage the debt, but to remove the person most likely to discover it, contest it, or interfere with whatever plan she'd built to survive it? If I was arrested on criminal charges, even charges that were ultimately unfounded, the reputational damage would be immediate and severe. A retired federal judge, accused of threatening behavior toward his own family. The story writes itself. And while I was managing an arrest, a criminal complaint, the humiliation of defending myself against accusations I had not made, Vanessa would have time. Time to move money. Time to restructure assets. Time to do whatever she needed to do with the estate before I could get a foothold. Or, and this thought came at 4:30 in the morning like ice water, what if the plan was larger than that? What if the goal wasn't just to distract me, but to discredit me entirely? To build a record of erratic, threatening behavior that could later be used as evidence in a competency proceeding. Declare him mentally incompetent. I sat very still on the edge of that hotel bed. If a court found me mentally incompetent, control of my assets, my pension, my investment accounts, my remaining property, could be transferred to a court-appointed guardian. And if that guardian happened to be recommended by the person who had orchestrated the competency proceeding in the first place, my hands were steady. I noticed that distantly and was grateful for it. Steady hands are a choice, in my experience, or at least a practice. You choose them over and over, and eventually they become habit. I reached for my phone and typed a message to Diane. I need a forensic accountant, someone with experience in estate fraud. I'll explain tomorrow. Get some sleep. 3 minutes later, she wrote back. Already awake. Already thinking the same thing. Sleep, Nathan. I put the phone down. I did not sleep. Sach. In the morning, I called Marisol. She answered immediately, her voice low. She was still at the house, still working, giving nothing away to Ethan and Vanessa. That alone told me everything I needed to know about her courage. Are you safe? I asked. I'm fine. They don't know I came out to you last night. I went straight back to the kitchen. Vanessa was in the dining room when the police arrived, and she never counted heads. Good, I exhaled. Marisol, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me, even if the honest answer is that you can't help, okay? Ask. How long have you known that something was wrong? The pause that followed lasted perhaps 5 seconds. When she spoke again, her voice was different, quieter, but also more weighted. Like she'd been carrying something she'd been waiting for permission to put down. Since spring, she said. March, maybe February, when the men started coming. What men? Lawyers, I think, or accountants. Men in suits who came in the afternoon when Mr. Ethan was at work, and who sat at the dining room table with Vanessa for 2-3 hours at a time. She always told me to stay in the back of the house when they were here. Never introduced them, never left documents out. A pause. Once, only once, I walked past the dining room doorway before she saw me coming, and I heard one of them say something about a guardian. A petition. I closed my eyes briefly. Did you catch a name? A firm name? Anything on the documents? I saw a letterhead once when I was clearing a glass from the table after they left. I didn't get the whole thing, but the first word was Prescott. I wrote it down. Marisol, I said, I'm going to need your help. I'm going to need you to be careful, and I'm going to make absolutely certain that you are protected every step of the way, whatever that takes. But I need to know. Are you willing? Another pause, shorter this time. Mr. Caldwell, she said, your wife was a good woman. She was kind to me for 14 years, and I watched these two people take what she loved and turn it into something she would not recognize. Her voice didn't waver. Yes, I'm willing. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat by the hotel window with a notepad and began to write down everything I knew, everything I suspected, and everything I needed to find out. I wrote in the methodical, column-by-column way that 30 years on the bench had built into the architecture of my thinking. Facts in one column, inferences in another, questions in a third. The facts column was sparse but devastating. The inferences column was longer and growing. The questions column was the longest of all. But at the top of the page, before any of it, I wrote 2 lines. Not for any strategic reason, just because I needed to say it to myself, plainly, without flinching. My son tried to have me arrested. Now I am going to find out why. But over the following 3 days, I moved carefully and quickly. Diane Okafor connected me with a forensic accountant named Raymond Chu, a former IRS investigator in his early 60s who specialized in estate fraud and asset concealment, and who had, according to Diane, an almost unnatural ability to follow money through corporate structures that were specifically designed not to be followed. He was quiet, methodical, and utterly without sentiment about his work, which was exactly what I needed. Raymond's first question, after I explained the situation in broad strokes, was, "Do you have access to the original property transfer documents for the estate?" "I have copies of everything I signed," I said, "and I kept the originals of my own." "Good. Bring me everything. Deed, transfer agreement, tax filings, any correspondence about the property from the last 4 years." I spent an afternoon going through the files I kept in a fireproof cabinet in my apartment. The meticulous documentation of a man who had watched, from the bench, what happened when people didn't keep records. I pulled everything related to the Hanover County property and brought it to Raymond's office the next morning. He spread the documents across a wide work table and began reading with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who was finding a story in numbers. I sat across from him and waited. After 40 minutes, he looked up. "The transfer," he said. "Was it structured as an outright gift or as a conditional transfer?" "Outright gift, fully transferred." He nodded slowly. "So you have no current legal interest in the property?" "Correct." "And since the transfer, have you made any financial contributions to the property? Repairs, improvements, taxes?" I thought about it. The first 2 years before the estrangement, I covered the property tax. Ethan was getting the practice established and money was tight. I paid it because I wanted to, kept all the receipts. Raymond made a note. "How much are we talking across those 2 years?" "Somewhere between $22,000 and $25,000. He made another note with a particular quality of attention that told me that number was going somewhere useful in his mind. "All right," he said. "Tell me about the business venture." I told him what little I knew. The real estate development partnership, the 2 unknown investors, the plan to use the estate as collateral. He listened without interrupting, then asked several specific questions about timing, about the names I'd heard mentioned. I only had one, vaguely recalled from the dinner 2 years ago, and about the law firm letterhead that Marisol had glimpsed, Prescott something. "Prescott Aldridge," he said immediately. "They're a Richmond firm. They do a lot of elder law and estate work, but they've also been connected to a few guardianship proceedings that raised questions in the legal community. Nothing proven, but questions." He said it flatly, without inflection, in the way that people who deal in evidence describe things they are not yet in a position to assert as fact, but that they know perfectly well are fact. "Raymond," I said, "I need to know what Ethan and Vanessa's actual financial situation looks like right now, as precisely as possible." He looked at me across the work table. "Give me a week," he said. I gave him a week. It was the longest week of my life, and I spent it doing the only thing I could do, which was wait and think and talk to Diane and try to sleep in the hotel room that I had extended by 4-night increments. On the 4th day, Marisol texted me a photograph. It was a piece of paper, a letter, or what appeared to be a letter, taken at an angle and slightly blurred as if she'd photographed it quickly and from a distance. The letter had confirmed what Raymond had told me. Prescott Aldridge, Attorneys at Law, Richmond, Virginia. The text was partially obscured, but I could read enough. Petition for guardianship proceeding, grounds of diminished capacity, supporting documentation from collateral witnesses, timeline for filing to be confirmed upon. My name appeared twice in the visible text. I sat for a long time with that photograph open on my phone. I didn't forward it to anyone immediately. I just looked at it. Diminished capacity. They were going to argue that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, that I was a danger to myself, that the man who had spent 31 years making legal decisions that shaped lives and precedents was no longer competent to decide what to do with his own money. And then, with that finding in hand, they would step in as the natural candidates to oversee my affairs, my pension, my investment accounts, the remaining property I held in my own name. Everything. It was elegant in the way that very ugly things sometimes are. I could see Vanessa's mind in it, her legal training, her particular gift for identifying leverage points and pressing on them precisely. She had looked at my life and found the one thing she could use against me. Not my record, not my reputation, not any genuine flaw in my character, but age itself. The cultural instinct to look at a man past 65 and ask if he still knows what's best for himself. She had planned to use my own retirement as the weapon that destroyed me. I was furious. I want to be clear about that because I don't think this story should give the impression that I remained perfectly composed through all of this like some kind of marble statue of judicial virtue. I was not composed. I was 68 years old, and I was in a hotel room, and my son was planning to have a court declare me incompetent, and I was sitting with a photograph of the letter that proved it. I was furious in a way I had not been furious in many years. A clean, clear, freezing fury that had no noise in it. The kind of anger that doesn't look like anger from the outside because it has nowhere to go but inward, where it becomes something else. Fuel, maybe. Or resolve. I forwarded the photograph to Diane. Then I called Raymond. "How's the week coming?" I asked. "I was going to call you tonight," he said. "Nathan, it's worse than I thought." He told me then, with the careful precision of a man delivering a diagnosis, what he had found in the 7 days he'd spent tracing the financial story of Ethan and Vanessa Caldwell. The real estate venture had collapsed. Not cleanly, catastrophically. The two investors Ethan had partnered with were not reputable developers, but men with connections to a network of fraudulent real estate schemes that was already under federal investigation in 2 other states. Ethan had either not known this or had known and convinced himself it wouldn't matter. The result was the same either way. When the venture fell apart, it took with it more money than I had understood was at risk. Raymond's number was $430,000. Gone. But that was only the beginning. To cover the first round of losses, Ethan had taken out a second mortgage on the estate, something he was able to do because the property was fully in his name. The mortgage was with a private lender, not a bank, which suggested that the application had been made after a bank had already said no. The interest rate on the private mortgage was predatory. The current balance, combined with penalties for a payment missed 3 months ago, was approaching $900,000. And the estate, the 4.7-acre property with the house I'd built and the oak trees I'd planted, was worth, at current market, just under $1.3 million, which meant that after the mortgage was satisfied, if the property were sold tomorrow, Ethan and Vanessa would walk away with roughly $400,000 before taxes and fees. Not enough to cover the other debts Raymond was beginning to trace through a web of credit cards, personal loans, and business accounts in various states of default. They were drowning. They had been drowning for at least 2 years, probably longer. And the arrest scheme, the dinner invitation, the false complaint to the police, the documentation of erratic behavior that would anchor the competency petition, was not a plan born of greed in the ordinary sense. It was a plan born of desperation. That didn't make it forgivable. I want to be absolutely clear about that. Understanding why someone has done something is not the same as accepting it. Ethan's financial recklessness, Vanessa's willingness to sacrifice my freedom to solve it, these things remain what they are, regardless of what drove them. But it did make it comprehensible. And comprehension, in my experience, is what gives you traction. "Raymond," I said when he had finished, "can you document all of this, every piece of it?" "Already working on it." "How long?" "Another 2 weeks, maybe 3. There are some shell accounts in Delaware I'm still untangling." "Get me everything you can," I said. "I want a complete picture." "You'll have it," he said. After I hung up, I sat for a while in the fading light of the hotel room. The interstate sound drifted in through the window. Somewhere below, a car door slammed. I thought about the driveway lined with oak trees, about the particular sound the gravel made under tires, about Patricia in the kitchen, her reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, the way she hummed to herself while she cooked, about Ethan at 9 years old, running across the back lawn with the clumsy, full-body joy of a child who doesn't yet know how to hold anything back. I thought about all the things that had been done in that house in my name and my absence, and I made myself a promise, sitting there in the getting dark of that hotel room. Not a dramatic promise, not the kind you make out loud to invisible audiences. A quiet one, the kind that goes down into the bones and stays there. I was going to find out everything. I was going to document everything. I was going to build a case so complete and so airtight that no judge in the state of Virginia could look at it without understanding exactly what had been done and to whom. And then I was going to walk into a courtroom, which happened to be the one place on earth where I knew exactly what I was doing. Raymond Chu called me on a Wednesday morning, 17 days after I'd first walked into his office with a cardboard box of property documents and a story he'd listened to without blinking. I was sitting at the small desk in my hotel room. I'd moved to a different place by then, a quieter extended stay on the west side of the city with a kitchenette and enough space to spread papers across a table. I'd been there 11 days. The routine had settled into something almost bearable. Coffee at 6, calls with Diane at 8, an hour of walking the neighborhood regardless of weather, because I'd learned decades ago that a body kept in motion thinks more clearly than one held still by anxiety. "Nathan," Raymond said, "I need you to come in." The way he said it, not, "I have some updates," or "I found a few things," but simply, "I need you to come in," told me that what he'd found was not a few things. It was the whole story. I was in his office by 10 o'clock. Raymond had rearranged his work table since my last visit. What had been an orderly spread of documents was now something closer to a map, papers arranged in clusters connected by handwritten annotations with several pages marked in red at the edges. He stood at the far end of the table with his reading glasses pushed up and his arms folded, looking at the whole layout with the expression of a man who has assembled a puzzle he wishes he hadn't. "Sit down," he said. I sat. "I'm going to walk you through this from the beginning," he said, "because the order matters. The order is actually part of what makes it so deliberate." "Go ahead." He started talking. What Raymond laid out over the next 90 minutes was not the story of a bad investment gone wrong. It was the story of a plan. A layered, multi-year plan with moving parts that had been built so carefully that even now, with all of it spread across this table, certain pieces were still difficult to see unless you knew what you were looking for. It had started, as best Raymond could reconstruct it, approximately 3.5 years ago, 18 months before Ethan had mentioned the real estate venture to me at that dinner, 18 months before the estrangement. At that point, Ethan and Vanessa's financial situation had already been deteriorating for at least a year. Not catastrophically, not yet, but in the steady, incremental way that debt accumulates when two people are living well beyond what their income can sustain. Vanessa had left her litigation firm to start her own practice 2 years prior, and the practice had not performed the way she'd projected. Ethan's income as a financial consultant was real, but not large enough to cover the gap. They had been drawing down a savings account that had not been replenished, running credit card balances that rolled forward month to month, and making minimum payments on a student loan refinancing package that was structured in a way Raymond described, with quiet disgust, as designed to never actually be paid off. They were behind, he said, not visibly, not in a way anyone looking from outside would notice, but structurally, they were already in trouble. Then came the real estate venture. Raymond had spent the better part of 3 weeks tracing the corporate structure of what Ethan had described to me as a development partnership. What he found was considerably less straightforward than that name implied. The partnership had been organized through a Delaware LLC with 2 members besides Ethan, a man named Garrett Stills and another named Philip Uber, both of whom had prior involvement in a series of commercial real estate transactions in Georgia and South Carolina that had ended in civil litigation and, in Uber's case, a settlement with the State Securities Commission. These were not reputable people, Raymond said. He said it plainly, without judgment, which somehow made it land harder. Whether Ethan knew that going in is a question I can't answer with documents, but someone with access to basic due diligence tools could have found Uber's settlement filing in about 45 minutes. I said nothing. The implication settled in the room. The venture collapsed because the underlying property it was built on had a title dispute that should have been caught in the initial review, Raymond continued. The short version is that the development couldn't proceed. The investors lost their contributions, and Ethan was left holding a personal guarantee he'd signed for a portion of the operating costs. How much? $380,000, which, combined with the existing debt load, pushed them into a position where the estate was the only asset of sufficient value to do anything with. He paused and looked at me directly, the way he did when he was about to say something he wanted to make sure I actually heard. Nathan, I want you to understand what I'm about to show you next, because this is where it stops being a financial story and becomes something else. He slid a folder across the table. I opened it. Inside were printed pages from what appeared to be a series of emails. The addresses were redacted. Raymond explained briefly that he had obtained these through a civil subpoena process Diane had initiated in connection with the police complaint from Saturday evening, but the content was intact. I read the first email, then the second. Then I set the folder down on the table and sat very still for a moment. The emails were between Vanessa and a partner at Prescott Aldridge, a man named Howard Sinclair. They were business emails, professional in tone, precisely the kind of correspondence that would look completely innocuous to anyone who didn't know what they were planning. But the content, read in sequence with Raymond's financial reconstruction as context, was not innocuous at all. The earliest email in the chain was dated 14 months ago. 14 months. That was 8 months before the dinner invitation. Vanessa had been building this for over a year. In the emails, she and Sinclair discussed the process for filing a petition of guardianship based on diminished mental capacity. They discussed what documentation would be required. They discussed the role of collateral witness statements. Multiple independent accounts, Sinclair had written, will significantly strengthen the petition. And they discussed, in one email that I had to read 3 times to fully absorb, the anticipated timeline for transferring fiduciary control of targeted assets once the petition was granted. Targeted assets. That was the phrase Sinclair had used. My pension, my investment accounts, the remaining property I held. All of it. And then there was one more email, the last in the chain, dated 6 weeks before the dinner invitation. The preliminary documentation is sufficient to file, Sinclair had written. However, the petition will be substantially stronger if we can demonstrate a documented pattern of concerning behavior, ideally with a law enforcement record attached. A formal complaint, even one that does not result in charges, creates a public record that supports the narrative of instability. Recommend creating an occasion for such a record to be established prior to filing. I put the folder down. The room was very quiet. An occasion, I said. A dinner invitation, Raymond said. I looked at the papers spread across the table, the emails, the corporate filings, the mortgage documents, the credit card records, the paper trail of 4 years of bad decisions, and one very deliberate conspiracy laid out in front of me like the blueprint of a demolition. They hadn't been trying to arrest me. Not ultimately. The arrest was never the end goal. The arrest was documentation. Evidence to attach to a petition that would then argue, with a police report as Exhibit A, that Nathan Caldwell had become erratic and threatening in his old age and could no longer be trusted to manage his own affairs. And then, with my assets under the control of a court-appointed guardian that Vanessa had already been cultivating for 14 months, they could restructure, pay off the mortgage, survive. And I would spend whatever time it took fighting a competency ruling in court, distracted, spending money on lawyers, my reputation smeared, while they used what was mine to buy themselves out of the hole they'd dug. It was sophisticated, it was patient, it was cold. And underneath all of it, underneath the legal strategy and the financial forensics and the carefully constructed paper trail, was my son's name, Ethan, who had sat across from Vanessa at a table in the house I'd built and agreed to this, who had sent me a text message that said just family and meant something else entirely. I want to ask you something, I said to Raymond, and I want your honest answer, not your careful answer. All right. Is there any version of this where Ethan didn't know? Raymond was quiet for a moment. It was not the quiet of a man who doesn't know the answer. It was the quiet of a man who respects the person he's about to disappoint. His name is on the mortgage application, he said. His signature is on the LLC operating agreement. There is one email in this chain, not in this folder, I'm still getting it authenticated, where Vanessa references a conversation she and Ethan had about the timing of the petition. He paused. I don't think he planned it. I think she planned it and brought him along. But I don't think he didn't know. I nodded once. Thank you for not softening that, I said. You didn't hire me to soften things. No, I said. I didn't. I gathered the folder and sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way I used to do in my chambers when I was working through a decision that had no clean edges. Then I called Diane. She answered before the second ring. Tell me. I need you to clear your afternoon, I said. We have work to do. Diane Okafor's office was on the 9th floor of a building 4 blocks from the courthouse where I had practiced law before taking the bench, and where I had appeared twice since retiring as an expert witness in federal proceedings. The office was organized in the particular way of a lawyer who works with large amounts of information, not cluttered but dense, with a quality of layered presence that told you something serious happened here. She had a second attorney with her when I arrived, a younger man she introduced as Marcus Webb, a civil litigator who specialized in elder law and estate disputes. He was 37, compact, with a precise handshake and the specific quality of attention that good lawyers have in rooms where something important is being decided. I laid out everything Raymond had given me. Diane and Marcus listened without interrupting. Raymond had come with me and supplied context where I couldn't, the corporate structure of the LLC, the specifics of the private mortgage, the authentication status of the emails. When we finished, Marcus leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. Okay, he said. Let me make sure I have the full picture. He counted on his fingers. We have documentary evidence of a premeditated scheme to file a fraudulent guardianship petition. We have emails between Vanessa Caldwell and Prescott Aldridge explicitly discussing the fabrication of a law enforcement record as supporting evidence. We have financial documentation establishing that the motivation was asset acquisition and debt relief. And we have, he looked at me, a police report filed October 12th referencing a complaint that was made before the subject of the complaint arrived at the property. Correct, I said. That last one is actually the cleanest piece, he said, because the timeline is documented independently. The police log will show what time they received the call and what time they arrived. Your cell phone records will show you were still on the highway when Vanessa made the call to dispatch. They filed a complaint about a man who wasn't there yet. Marisol Vega can testify to when I arrived on the property and that I did not enter, I said. And she heard the call being made? She was on the other side of the kitchen door. She heard enough to know what it was. Marcus looked at Diane. Something passed between them in the quick, shorthand way of people who have worked together long enough to communicate without speaking. We need to talk about how we use this, Diane said, because there are 2 separate tracks here. There's the criminal complaint, the false report, the conspiracy, potentially wire fraud depending on how the emails are characterized. And there's the civil track, the guardianship petition, which hasn't been filed yet, but which we now have documentary evidence is being prepared. Can we get ahead of the guardianship petition? I asked. Yes, Marcus said. We can file a preemptive motion establishing your competency and attaching this evidence, which effectively poisons any petition Prescott Aldridge files before it gets traction. But the timing matters. We need to file before they do. How soon can you be ready? He thought about it. If Raymond can get me the authenticated financial documents and the emails by end of week, he can, I said. Then 2 weeks, maybe 10 days. Do it in 10, Diane said. She looked at me. Nathan, I need to ask you something that's going to sound clinical but isn't. Go ahead. What do you want the outcome of this to be? Not legally? I know what we can argue legally, but you. She held my gaze. This is your son. Whatever path we take is going to change what exists between you permanently. I need to know what you're trying to preserve, if anything, so we build toward that. The room went quiet in the particular way it does when someone has asked the question that matters most, and everyone in the room knows it. I had thought about this. I had thought about almost nothing else in the small hours of the mornings that kept arriving in that hotel room. The gray 4 a.m. hours when all the tactical clarity dissolved and what was left was just the plain human fact of it. My son. The boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder on car trips, and who had stood at his mother's grave in the rain and wept so hard he could barely stand. I want justice, I said. I want the record corrected. I want the estate protected. And I want my son to have to look at what he did clearly enough that he can't lie to himself about it anymore. I paused. I'm not interested in destroying him, but I'm also not going to protect him from consequences he earned. Diane held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once. That I can work with, she said. The next 10 days were the strangest I have ever lived through, and I have had some strange days. On the surface, nothing was happening. I was a man in an extended stay hotel room, reading documents and making phone calls and taking long walks in the October cold. Ethan and Vanessa, as far as I could tell from what Marisol carefully, quietly reported, were proceeding normally, going to work, coming home, having the occasional dinner with people I didn't know. Vanessa had apparently told several people in their social circle that Nathan was going through a difficult period, that he'd shown up at the house unannounced and had to be asked to leave, that they were concerned. Building the narrative, Diane had said when Marisol passed this along. She was right, and knowing that didn't make it easier to hear. My name was being quietly, systematically dirtied in rooms I wasn't in, by a woman who had spent years watching how institutions worked and knew exactly how a story spread. I stayed quiet. I walked. I read. I trusted the process. On the 5th day, Marisol found something. She called me at 7 in the evening, her voice lower than usual. I found documents, she said, in Vanessa's home office. She was out this afternoon and Mr. Ethan wasn't home yet, and I was cleaning. I go in there every 2 weeks, she knows I do. And there was a folder that had slid partially under the desk. I don't think she noticed it had fallen. What kind of documents? Printed emails, and what looks like a draft petition, with your name at the top. She paused. There are statements in it, from 2 people I've never heard of, saying that you called them, that you were angry and confused, that you made statements that frightened them. I gripped the phone. Collateral witnesses, I said. I don't know what that means, but it didn't feel right. I took photographs. She sent them to my phone. I looked at the images. Blurry in places, but legible enough. The draft petition from Prescott Aldridge. 2 witness statements from names I didn't recognize, people I had never spoken to, whose contact information had presumably come from Vanessa's network. Statements asserting things I had never said and behaviors I had never exhibited, signed and dated 2 weeks ago. I forwarded everything to Diane immediately. Her text came back within minutes. This is enough. Marcus is filing Monday. Check. I want to tell you what Marisol said to me the next morning, because I think it matters. She called before I'd finished my coffee. Not with information this time, just to talk, which was unlike her. Marisol was not a woman who called to chat. She was economical with words, the way people become economical when they've learned that words cost something. Mr. Caldwell, she said, can I ask you something personal? Of course. When you found out, all of it, the plan, the money, what they were going to do. She paused. Were you surprised about your son? I thought about how to answer that honestly. I was surprised by the specifics, I said. I was not surprised that Vanessa was capable of this. I had suspected for years that there was something underneath her that I couldn't see clearly. But Ethan... I stopped. Part of me had been warning myself about Ethan for a long time. Not this specifically, but the general direction, the way he made decisions, the way he chose her over every conflict, the way he stopped calling. I took a breath. I think I knew something was wrong before I had the evidence for it. I just didn't want to act on instinct because I loved him. Marisol was quiet for a moment. My second son, she said finally. He was involved with someone who was bad for him. For years I watched it. I said things, and he didn't want to hear them, and I had to decide, do I keep saying them and lose him, or do I stay and wait? She paused. I stayed and waited. It took a long time, but eventually he saw it himself. I didn't say anything. I don't know if that's useful, she said. I just wanted you to know I understood something of what you're carrying. I thanked her. And after I hung up, I sat for a while with my cold coffee and thought about what it meant. The fact that the woman who had shown me more loyalty in the past 3 weeks than my own son had shown me in the past 2 years was not someone I was related to by blood. She owed me nothing. She had risked something real by coming out to that driveway in the dark. There's a lesson in that. I've turned it over many times since, about the nature of family and what that word actually means when you clear away the legal and genetic definitions and look at what's left. It means people who show up, people who tell you the truth when it costs them something, people who are willing to be uncomfortable on your behalf. Marisol Vega was family. I had simply not named her that before. Suck. Marcus filed on a Monday. A preemptive motion in the Circuit Court of the City of Richmond, contesting the anticipated competency petition with attached documentary evidence of fraudulent intent. Raymond's financial analysis was appended in full. The emails between Vanessa and Sinclair at Prescott Aldridge, now fully authenticated, were filed as exhibits. The draft petition with fabricated witness statements was included. The police report timeline, showing that the complaint had been called in before my vehicle appeared on the property, was attached with my cell carrier's location data for the evening in question, and Marisol's signed affidavit, prepared by Diane 2 days earlier in a session I had not attended because I thought her account would be more authentic without me present, was the last exhibit. 22 paragraphs of precise, careful recollection, what she had heard through the kitchen door, when she had come outside, what I had done, and where I had gone. The timeline, in her own words, from a witness who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Diane called me when the filing was submitted. "It's in," she said. "Good," I said. "Howard Sinclair at Prescott Aldridge is going to have a very unpleasant afternoon when their copy arrives." I thought about that, about Sinclair's email, recommend creating an occasion for such a record to be established, and what it meant for his bar license now that that email was a court exhibit. "And Ethan?" I asked. A brief pause. "He'll be served by end of day." I sat with that for a moment. My son being served with legal papers that documented his role in a conspiracy against his own father. Papers that he would open, presumably, in the house I'd built. Papers that contained his signature on documents he could not disavow. "Diane," I said, "when this gets to the criminal referral stage, and I assume it will, it already is, the DA's office has the same package. They've been reviewing since last week." "I know. I'm just—" I stopped, tried to locate what I was trying to say. "I need you to make sure the DA understands that my goal is accountability, not maximum damage. There's a difference." "I know the difference, Nathan. So does Marcus." "I know you do," I said. I just needed to say it out loud. After I hung up, I walked to the window of the hotel room and looked out at the city. The trees in the park across the street were in full fall color now, a week past peak, dropping fast, the sidewalk below littered with leaves going dark at the edges. November was close. The year was tilting toward its end. I thought about the last normal conversation I'd had with Ethan before everything fell apart. Not the dinner that ended in shouting. Before that, something ordinary. A phone call, maybe. Talking about nothing in particular. The sound of my son's voice when he wasn't performing anything, wasn't managing anything, was just talking to his father. I couldn't remember exactly what we talked about. That bothered me. I spent a few minutes trying to retrieve it and couldn't, and eventually I let it go. Some things you can't hold on to, regardless of how much you want to. Woke. 11 days after the filing, Vanessa called me. I almost didn't answer. I stood there for 3 full rings, watching her name on the screen, remembering Diane's instruction from the beginning of all this. Do not contact Ethan or Vanessa. Diane had not told me not to answer if they called. That was a distinction I was aware of, even as I reached for the phone. I answered. "Nathan." Her voice was controlled, professionally controlled, the particular vocal register of someone who has spent years in courtrooms and conference rooms and knows how to strip affect from their delivery when affect is a liability. "I think we should talk." "You're calling a represented party without his attorney present," I said. "You know that's not something I'm going to allow to continue." "I'm not calling in any official capacity. I'm calling as your daughter-in-law." "Vanessa," I said, "whatever you call yourself on this call, whatever you say on this call, is going to be evaluated in the context of a legal proceeding that you helped create. I'm going to end this call now and inform my attorney that you contacted me. A beat. Nathan. And for just a moment, just a fraction of a moment, the controlled register cracked, and underneath it, I heard something else. Not remorse, not fear exactly, something more complicated than either. I want you to know that Ethan doesn't know I'm calling. I'm sure that's true, I said. Goodbye, Vanessa. I ended the call and sat down heavily in the desk chair and stared at the wall. I want to be clear about something. Ending that call was not easy. There was a version of me that wanted to talk to her, that wanted to ask why, that wanted to hear her explain how a person builds a plan like this, what the internal architecture of it looks like, at what point she looked at her husband's father and decided that he was a problem to be eliminated rather than a person to be considered. But I knew, because 31 years on the bench teaches you this, if nothing else, that the why rarely satisfies. People do terrible things for comprehensible reasons, and the comprehensibility doesn't help. What helps is the record. What helps is the facts in front of a judge who has to make a decision based on evidence rather than explanation. I forwarded the notification of her call to Diane, time-stamped, with a note. Contact attempt from Vanessa at 4:47 p.m. I ended the call. She stated Ethan was not aware she was calling. Diane wrote back 30 seconds later, "Perfect. Don't answer again." I set the phone down and looked at my hands, steady. What I had not told Diane, what I hadn't told anyone because it wasn't the kind of thing that has a place in a legal proceeding, was that hearing Vanessa's voice had not made me angry. It had made me tired. A specific and profound tiredness that was not about sleep. I'd been sleeping better, actually, since the filing went in, as if the act of moving had released something that had been damming up in my chest. It was the tiredness that comes from sustained proximity to a particular kind of human behavior. The sustained effort of watching someone you once hoped to love, however conditionally, be exactly as small as your worst suspicion of them. That night I ordered dinner to the room and ate it at the desk, reading through Raymond's final financial report for what was probably the fourth time. Not because I needed new information, because reading facts, numbers, dates, documented sequences of cause and effect, has always been how I calm down. The world of facts is orderly. It doesn't shift based on who's looking at it. A debt is a debt. A date is a date. A signature is a signature. Ethan had signed documents he shouldn't have signed. Vanessa had written emails she shouldn't have written. Howard Sinclair at Prescott Aldridge had given advice that no attorney should give. And all of it was in a folder in a courthouse filing system, bearing a case number, waiting for a judge to read it. That was something I understood, that I knew how to trust. What I did not know, what I could not yet see clearly, was what was happening inside the house at the end of the long oak-lined driveway. What Ethan and Vanessa were saying to each other now that the filing had arrived. Whether they were fighting, whether there were cracks forming, whether my son, confronted with the evidence of what he'd agreed to, was capable of looking at it clearly. Marisol had told me that afternoon, in one of her brief, careful texts. Tension in the house. They were up late last night. This morning he left early without breakfast. I read that text several times before putting my phone away. Then I went to bed, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I slept through until morning. Fuck. The call from the DA's office came on a Thursday. An assistant district attorney named Priya Nair, whom Diane knew professionally and had worked with on the criminal referral, wanted to schedule a meeting. She was careful on the phone, careful in the way that people in her position are careful when they're about to tell you something significant and need to do it properly rather than in a preliminary call. But there was something in her tone, underneath the care, that told me the meeting was not going to be bad news. Diane confirmed it after I hung up. Priya told me, off the record, that what Raymond documented around the private mortgage meets the threshold for financial fraud, and the emails to Sinclair are strong enough for a conspiracy charge. I processed that. Sinclair? I asked. He's likely looking at ethics referral to the state bar as a minimum. Possibly criminal exposure depending on what the DA decides about his role. His firm is apparently already in internal crisis. Apparently the managing partner was unaware of the substance of what Sinclair was doing and is not happy. Diane paused. Nathan, I want to be honest with you about what comes next. This is going to get public. Once the criminal charges are filed, the press will pick it up. A retired federal judge, his son and daughter-in-law, a guardianship conspiracy. It's a story. People will write about it. I know. Are you prepared for that? I thought about it. Genuinely thought about it. Not as a rhetorical exercise, but as an actual reckoning with what public exposure meant. My name in headlines, Ethan's name, the estate, the dinner invitation. All of it turned into a narrative that strangers would consume with the particular appetite people have for other people's disasters. What's the alternative? I asked. There isn't one. Not if we pursue this fully. Then yes, I said. I'm prepared. After I hung up, I pulled on my coat and went for a walk. The November air had an edge to it now, proper cold, the city stripped of its color and settling into the gray business of winter. I walked for 40 minutes without any particular destination, through neighborhoods I knew and a few I didn't, past a park where children were playing some game that involved running and shouting and the complete physical investment that children bring to everything. I stopped and watched them for a moment. There was a boy at the edge of the group, maybe 9 or 10, who had fallen behind the main action and was standing with his hands on his knees catching his breath. He looked up at the others, assessing something, calculating his re-entry. Then he straightened up and ran back into the middle of it, not carefully, not strategically, just running, committed to it the way children commit to things before they learn to hold anything back. I watched him for another moment. Then I turned and walked back toward the hotel. I was thinking about Ethan at 9 years old, running across the lawn. And I was thinking about how the same person can become so many different things, and how love does not resolve that. How love sometimes just makes the distance between the person you knew and the person they became more painful than simple estrangement would be. That's the part nobody tells you, that the grief of betrayal is not a single event. It doesn't arrive all at once and announce itself and then recede. It lives in the small moments, in the park, in the boy running, in the memory that shows up without warning and just sits there in your chest until you breathe through it and keep moving. I kept moving. 3 blocks from the hotel, my phone buzzed. A text from Marisol. He went out tonight alone, without her, first time in weeks. I stood on the sidewalk and read it. Then I wrote back, "Thank you. Be safe." And I kept walking. The hearing was set for the second Tuesday of December. 43 days after I had sat in the dark at the end of my own driveway and watched 2 police officers walk up to my son's front porch. 43 days of hotel rooms and legal strategy and Marisol's careful text and Raymond's financial documents and Diane's phone calls that always started with the same 3 words. Here's what's happening. 43 days of keeping my mouth shut and my hands steady and my mind on the work instead of on the grief, which was always there underneath the work, patient as weather. I had been inside a courtroom, in one capacity or another, for the better part of 4 decades. I had sat at counsel's table as a young attorney barely older than the clients I was representing. I had stood at the bench as a judge and watched the faces of people whose lives were being decided by the arguments being made below me. I had returned, in retirement, as a witness and as an observer. I understood courtrooms the way some people understand their own neighborhoods. The particular acoustic quality, the way light falls through institutional windows in the morning versus the afternoon. The specific grammar of formality that settles over a room when a judge enters and everyone stands. I understood all of it, and none of that understanding made walking into courtroom 7 of the Richmond Circuit Court on a Tuesday morning in December feel anything other than exactly what it was. The most important day of the rest of my life. Diane was beside me. Marcus Webb was beside her. Raymond was behind us with 2 banker's boxes of financial documentation. We arrived 40 minutes early because Diane did not believe in arriving at anything less than 40 minutes early when the stakes were this high, and because I needed time to sit in the room before it filled, to reorient to the space and remember what I knew. Ethan and Vanessa arrived 20 minutes later with their attorney, a man named Gerald Coates, who had a regional reputation for aggressive civil defense, and who I had appeared before twice during my time on the bench, finding him skilled and not above certain procedural gamesmanship. He walked in with the slightly elevated posture of a man who has convinced his clients he can win, which is not the same as the posture of a man who believes it. Ethan came in without looking at me. He was dressed in a dark suit I hadn't seen before, his hair shorter than I remembered. He walked with his eyes on the floor ahead of him and took his seat at the defense table and opened a folder and appeared to read it, though I don't believe he was reading anything. He was simply placing something between himself and the room. Vanessa sat beside him. She looked, as always, immaculate. Dark blazer, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back. The expression of a woman who had decided before entering this room exactly what she was going to project and was projecting it with professional discipline. She looked composed. She looked like someone preparing to be wrongly accused of something, which I had to give her credit for. It was exactly the right performance for the moment. She did not look at me either. I looked at both of them steadily for a moment, and then I turned to face forward, because I had done everything I could do in the weeks before this morning, and what came next belonged to Diane and Marcus and Raymond and the file of evidence sitting in those two bankers' boxes. Judge Patricia Holloway entered at 9:02. She was 61 years old, a Clinton appointee who had been elevated to the circuit level 11 years ago, and she had a reputation for tight courtroom management and an extremely low tolerance for procedural theater. I had never appeared before her personally, but Diane knew her work well and had said, when the case was assigned, "That's a good draw." Not because Holloway was sympathetic to our position, she wouldn't be to any position going in, but because she was the kind of judge who made decisions based on what was in front of her and not on anything else, which, given what we had in front of her, was exactly what we needed. "Be seated," she said. She opened the case file and read for exactly 90 seconds in complete silence. Then she looked up. "Ms. Okafor, this is your motion. You have the floor." Demort. Diane stood. There are lawyers who perform in courtrooms, who understand their role as essentially theatrical and deploy accordingly. And there are lawyers who simply tell the truth with precision and trust that the truth is sufficient. Diane was the second kind, which made her devastating in a different way than the first kind. She didn't give you anything to push against. She just laid things down, one after another, and let them accumulate. She began with the timeline. The dinner invitation, dated and time-stamped. My drive to the property. The police dispatch log, which showed that the complaint call had been received at 7:14 p.m. My cell carrier's location data, which placed my vehicle on State Route 1, 8 miles from the estate, at 7:11 p.m. 3 minutes before the call was made, I was 8 miles away. By the time Marisol came out to my car, I had been parked in the driveway for approximately 4 minutes. I had not rung the bell. I had not knocked. I had not come within 200 feet of the front door. The complaint had been filed about a man who wasn't there yet. Judge Holloway made a note. Then Diane moved to the emails. She walked through them slowly, reading key passages aloud, pausing after each one to let the language sit in the room without commentary. She didn't editorialize. She didn't explain what the emails meant. She let Howard Sinclair's own words do it. Recommend creating an occasion for such a record to be established prior to filing. She read it once, set down the paper, and moved on to the next document. I watched the judge's face as Diane read. Holloway was a disciplined reader. She maintained the same expression through most of it, the focused neutrality of a person processing information without reacting to it. But at the passage about creating an occasion, something shifted briefly in her eyes. Not outrage. She was too practiced for outrage. Something more controlled than that. Recognition, maybe. Of what it meant. Of what it was. Gerald Coates objected twice during Diane's presentation. Once on the authentication of the emails, which Marcus had anticipated and rebutted immediately with the chain of custody documentation from the civil subpoena. Once on relevance, which Holloway dismissed with a single sentence. The motion concerns alleged fraudulent intent in the preparation of a competency petition, Mr. Coates. Emails discussing that preparation are directly relevant, overruled. Coates sat back. Then Diane called Marisol. I had not been certain until the morning of the hearing whether Marisol would testify in person or by written affidavit. She had the option. Diane had given her the option, explicitly, twice, because her position in the house was not without risk. Testifying openly, in a proceeding where Vanessa was present, meant that whatever remained of her employment at the estate was effectively over. It meant she was choosing, publicly and irrevocably, which side of this she stood on. She had chosen. She walked to the witness stand in a dark coat I had never seen before, carrying a small handbag that she set on the railing with both hands before sitting. She was composed, not performatively, not stiffly, but with the particular composure of someone who has decided something and is no longer second-guessing the decision. She looked like what she was, a woman who had come here to tell the truth and intended to do exactly that. Diane walked her through it methodically. The call she had overheard from behind the kitchen door, the specific language she had heard Vanessa use, he's been making threats. We're frightened. In a voice that Marisol described as calm. She didn't sound frightened, Marisol said. She sounded like she was reading something. What did you do after you overheard this call? Diane asked. I went to the side door, Marisol said. I saw headlights on the driveway. I knew Mr. Caldwell was arriving. And what did you do? I went out to him. I told him not to go to the door. Were you frightened to do that? Marisol paused. A real pause, not a performed one. Yes, she said. I didn't know what would happen to my job. I've worked in that house for 14 years, but I also... She stopped, took a breath. I knew what I had heard, and I knew what it meant. Diane thanked her and sat down. Coates rose for cross-examination. He was careful with her. Careful in the way that experienced attorneys are careful with witnesses who have nothing to gain from lying, because aggressive cross-examination of an honest witness tends to make the witness look more honest and the attorney look desperate. He questioned her on the specific words she'd heard, the distance from the door, whether she could be certain of the content. Marisol answered every question with the same steady specificity. She didn't elaborate. She didn't get defensive. She answered what was asked and stopped. At one point, Coates pressed her. Isn't it possible that you misunderstood what you heard? That Mrs. Caldwell was expressing genuine concern and you've interpreted it in the context of a pre-existing bias toward your employer? Marisol looked at him for a moment. She said, He'll be there by 7:15, Marisol said. Make sure the officer arrives no later than 7:30. That is what I heard through that door. She paused. I've thought about it many times. That is what I heard. The room was very quiet. Coates said, No further questions, and sat down. Raymond took the stand after the lunch recess. He was, as always, completely without affect in a professional context, a quality that I had initially found disconcerting and had come to understand was actually his greatest strength. He presented financial findings the way a good doctor delivers a diagnosis. Here's what the data shows. Here's what it means. Here is the documentation that supports the conclusion. No drama. No inflection designed to guide your response. Just the information, assembled with such methodical completeness that the picture it formed was inescapable. He walked through the collapse of the LLC, the private mortgage, the accumulated debt, the timeline of financial deterioration running parallel, on the same chart, to the timeline of correspondence between Vanessa and Howard Sinclair. He had prepared the chart himself, a simple two-column visual that required no interpretation to understand what it showed. The worse the money got, the more frequently Vanessa wrote to Sinclair about the guardianship petition. The escalation was not subtle. Then he reached the last section of his report. In addition to the elements previously described, he said, in the same flat, clear voice he'd used for everything else. My analysis identified transfers from a joint account held by Ethan and Vanessa Caldwell to a personal account held solely in Vanessa Cross's name. These transfers began approximately 9 months ago and total, to date, $147,000. Coates was on his feet immediately. Objection. This goes beyond the scope of the motion before the court. It goes to intent and financial motive, Your Honor, Marcus said from beside Diane, not rising, just speaking. The transfers occurred during the period covered by the conspiracy documentation and are directly relevant to the question of premeditation. Judge Holloway looked at the chart Raymond had provided. She looked at it for several seconds. I'll allow it, she said. Proceed. Coates sat back down. I did not look at him. I looked at Ethan. My son had been sitting with his eyes on the defense table through most of the morning, a posture of studied non-engagement that I recognized as the specific body language of someone trying to be invisible inside their own skin. But at the moment Raymond spoke the number, $147,000 transferred into Vanessa's personal account. Ethan's head came up. He turned and looked at Vanessa. It was a small movement, a fraction of a second, but it was not a look of shared understanding between two people who know something together. It was a different kind of look, the look of someone who has just heard something he did not know. Vanessa did not turn toward him. She kept her eyes forward, on the witness stand, on Raymond's impassive face. The silence between them lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then Ethan looked back down at the table. But I had seen it, and from the slight adjustment in Diane's posture beside me, I knew she had seen it too. Bed. The afternoon session was Coates's opportunity to present the defense. He was, I will acknowledge, a skilled attorney in an impossible position. The evidence Diane and Marcus had filed was not partial. It was not circumstantial. It was a documented, time-stamped, cross-referenced account of a plan that had been executed over 14 months by people who had put enough of it in writing to constitute their own conviction. Coates was not working with insufficient evidence. He was working against evidence that was effectively self-explanatory. His job was not to win on the merits. His job was to find any angle, any procedural gap, any interpretive ambiguity that might dilute the certainty of what was in front of the judge. He argued that the emails between Vanessa and Sinclair were professional communications between an attorney and client related to legitimate estate planning concerns, taken out of context by opposing counsel. He argued that the police complaint, while admittedly filed before my arrival, reflected genuine fear based on prior interactions, and that the timing was unfortunate but not indicative of bad faith. He argued that Raymond's financial analysis, while comprehensive, drew conclusions that went beyond the documented evidence. And then he called Vanessa to the stand. I watched her walk to the witness chair. She settled into it with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years in courtrooms, back straight, hands in her lap, gaze directed at Coates with the focused attentiveness of a cooperative witness. She was very good. I want to give her that because I think honesty requires acknowledging it. She was very, very good. Coates walked her through a version of events that was almost recognizable. In her telling, the dinner invitation had been genuine, a sincere attempt at reconciliation, because Ethan had been troubled by the estrangement and wanted to repair things. The police call had been made, she said, because in the weeks before the dinner she had received several disturbing voicemail messages from a number she didn't recognize that she believed to be mine. Messages that had frightened her. She had not reported them at the time, so she hadn't wanted to escalate. But when the dinner was imminent and she thought about me arriving at the house in an agitated state, she had called as a precaution. The voicemails, she said, had been deleted by accident. Of course they had. The emails to Sinclair, she explained, were part of a broader estate planning discussion she had initiated after becoming concerned about certain behaviors she had observed in me over the past 2 years. Confusion during phone calls, erratic statements made at social events, a level of financial decision-making that seemed inconsistent with my prior patterns. She had consulted Sinclair not to harm me, she said, but out of genuine concern for my well-being. She said it with exactly the right amount of controlled emotion. Not enough to seem performed, just enough to seem sincere. I sat and listened to all of it. I kept my face still. I had spent 31 years making decisions about who was telling the truth and who was telling a story, and I was watching a story being told. The seams were visible to me, but I understood they might not be visible to everyone. Then Diane stood up for cross-examination. She had a folder in her hand. She set it on the podium and opened it without ceremony and looked at Vanessa for a moment with the particular expression that I had learned over 19 years of watching her work meant she was about to do something she had been saving. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, "you testified that you received voicemail messages that frightened you, messages that you later deleted accidentally. That's correct? And these messages came from a number you believed to be Mr. Caldwell's?" "I believed so, yes." "Can you describe the content of those messages in general terms?" Vanessa paused, not long, but perceptibly, the pause of someone choosing a word carefully. "They were angry," she said, "accusatory. He made references to the property, to financial matters." "References that frightened you?" "Yes." Diane reached into the folder and drew out a single page. I'm introducing Exhibit 23, she said. This is a certified record from Mr. Caldwell's cellular carrier, covering all outgoing calls and messages from his number during the 18 months prior to the October dinner. She set a copy on the defense table in front of Coates and gave one to the clerk for the judge. The record shows 0 calls or messages from Mr. Caldwell's number to any number registered to or associated with Vanessa Cross or Ethan Caldwell during that period. She let that sit. 0, Diane said again, not for effect, but because it was the accurate word. Not deleted, not unanswered, 0. They were not made. Vanessa's composure did not crack. I will give her that. She was extraordinary under fire. Her expression shifted into something that read as confusion, that performed the specific affect of a person encountering a discrepancy they can't immediately explain. He may have used a different phone, she said, or a blocked number. Diane said. She reached into the folder again. Exhibit 24. This is a forensic analysis of incoming calls to the number registered in your name during the same 18-month period. No calls from blocked numbers. No calls from unregistered or prepaid numbers other than 2 from a restaurant delivery service in March of last year. She closed the folder. You testified under oath that you received frightening voicemail messages from my client, she said. The phone records from both parties established that no such calls were made or received. I may have been mistaken about the number, Vanessa said. Her voice had not changed. That was what was unnerving about it, the absence of a reaction. Memory is imperfect. It is, Diane agreed, which is why we have phone records. She looked at her notes. I'd like to ask you about the transfers. For the first time, something changed in Vanessa's face. Subtle. A slight compression around the eyes, a particular quality of stillness that was different from the stillness she'd been maintaining, like a temperature drop. $147,000, Diane said, transferred from the joint account you share with your husband into a personal account in your name alone. These transfers occurred over 9 months, beginning around the time your correspondence with Howard Sinclair commenced. She looked up. Your husband was not aware of these transfers, was he? We discussed our finances regularly. That's not what I asked. Was your husband specifically aware of these specific transfers into your personal account? A beat. I managed the household accounts, Vanessa said, so he was not aware. I don't believe he tracked individual transfers, no. Diane looked at her for a moment. Thank you, she said simply, and sat down. The room was very quiet. I looked at Ethan. He was sitting with one hand flat on the table in front of him, not moving, staring at something that wasn't in the courtroom. He looked like a man who had just understood, with the terrible finality of documented fact, that the woman he had chosen over everyone and everything else in his life had been moving money into a private account for 9 months without telling him, had been building a personal escape route while the plan they were supposedly executing together was aimed at my destruction. I don't know what Ethan felt in that moment. I can guess, but guessing at my son's interior life has been an unreliable enterprise for years. What I know is what his face looked like something had just fallen and broken, quietly, in a room only he could hear. Judge Holloway called a brief recess before delivering her ruling. 15 minutes, which she spent presumably reading through the last of the documentary record, while the courtroom hummed with the particular low-level noise of people who have been sitting in a high-stakes room for several hours and are trying to relieve the tension of it with small movements and murmured conversations. I stepped into the hallway with Diane and Marcus. Well, I said. Don't, Diane said. I'm not asking you to predict. I'm asking how you feel. She looked at me. I feel like we put 4 months of work in front of a judge who reads evidence carefully and that the evidence is unambiguous. She adjusted the strap of her bag. So I feel cautiously correct. Marcus was looking at his phone. Coates just texted his assistant to find him a parking spot for tomorrow, he said, which means he doesn't think this is going his way. How do you know what Coates texted his assistant? Marcus looked up. He looked mildly embarrassed. We were in the same firm 8 years ago. His assistant is still a friend. I looked at him. Is that ethical? He texted her. She forwarded it to me. It's a parking spot. He put his phone away. I'm just saying, and he's not acting like a man who expects good news. I leaned against the corridor wall and looked at the scuffed linoleum floor. Old courthouse floor, worn in the patterns of decades of people standing in exactly this spot, waiting for exactly this kind of moment. How many people had stood here, I wondered? How many had gone back into that room and had their lives go one way instead of another? How many had stood in this hallway with their lawyer and tried to read the shape of what was coming? I want to tell you something, I said to Diane and to Marcus, because they had both earned it. Whatever happens in there, whatever the ruling is, what the two of you have done in the last 4 months is not something I take for granted. You built something real, out of what could have stayed invisible. I stopped. I don't have better words for it than that. Diane looked at me with the expression she reserved for moments she chose not to deflect. Nathan, she said, let's just go get your life back. We went back in. Judge Holloway came out 4 minutes later. She sat. She opened the file. She looked at it for a moment, not reading. She'd done her reading in the recess, but with the settled attention of someone preparing to speak carefully. I've reviewed the submitted evidence in this matter at length, both the written record filed in advance and the testimony and documentation presented this morning, she said. Her voice was measured, the voice of someone who has delivered many rulings and understands that the measured voice is itself a form of respect for what a ruling means to the people it affects. I'm going to be direct, she paused. The motion before this court asks for a preemptive finding that the anticipated competency petition is grounded in fabricated evidence and fraudulent intent. That is a high bar. It requires not merely that the petitioning party's evidence be weak, but that the intent behind it be demonstrably and provably dishonest. Another pause. The court finds that bar has been met. I heard Diane exhale beside me, very quietly. She had been holding that breath for a long time. The documentary record before this court, Holloway continued, establishes with a degree of specificity I find unusual in civil proceedings, a premeditated effort to manufacture evidence in support of a fraudulent legal action. The email correspondence is unambiguous in its language and in the timeline of its escalation. The phone record contradicts key testimony offered by the respondent today. The financial analysis presents a clear and documented motivation for the scheme. She looked up from the file. The court further notes that witness testimony offered by Mrs. Caldwell today was directly and materially contradicted by documented evidence, a fact this court takes with the utmost seriousness. She set down her pen. The competency petition, should it be filed, is hereby preemptively dismissed. Any assets or accounts of Nathan Caldwell remain fully under his own authority and control. The court is referring this matter to the district attorney's office. I understand a criminal referral has already been initiated, and this court's findings are being forwarded to augment that process. She looked over the room. The court is further referring the conduct of Howard Sinclair, partner at Prescott Aldridge, to the Virginia State Bar for ethics review. His participation in the planning of a fraudulent legal proceeding as documented in this record raises concerns that extend well beyond this case. She closed the file. Motion granted in full, she said. We're adjourned. She stood. The clerk called it. Everyone rose. And that was it. Not loudly, not with the cinematic gravity that the word victory implies. Just the clean procedural click of a door closing on the thing that had been built to destroy me. Judge Holloway walked out and the room began to move. Attorneys gathering papers, the clerk logging the ruling, people near the back starting toward the doors. And I stood at the plaintiff's table and felt the specific, complicated sensation of having been right about something you desperately wished you'd been wrong about. I turned and looked at the defense table. Coates was already on his phone. Vanessa was sitting completely still, her hands folded in front of her on the table, her expression controlled in a way that required visible effort for the first time all day. The composure was still there, technically, but you could see the work it was costing. And Ethan. Ethan was standing. He had pushed back from the table and was standing with his coat over his arm, not moving toward the door, not moving toward me, just standing. He looked like a man who wasn't sure which direction any of the exits were. He looked up and found my eyes. We looked at each other across the width of the courtroom, across the 2 bankers' boxes and the distance of 2 years and the file of evidence that had been necessary because of choices he had made, across all of it. I didn't say anything. I didn't nod. I didn't look away either. He was the one who looked down first. Diane put her hand briefly on my arm. "Come on," she said quietly. "Let's get you out of here." I gathered my jacket. I picked up the folder I hadn't opened once during the day because everything I'd needed was in Diane's hands. I walked out of courtroom 7 the way I had walked into it, steadily, without hurrying, with the specific deliberateness of a man who has somewhere to be. Behind me, I heard the low sound of Coates's voice beginning a damage assessment conversation with his client, the particular urgent murmur of a lawyer recalibrating. And underneath that, very briefly, I heard something that might have been Ethan's voice. Not words, just a sound. Something that could have been talking to Vanessa, or could have been talking to the air. I didn't stop. Some thresholds, once crossed, don't benefit from pausing at the edge. You keep moving. You walk out into the December light, and you keep moving, and you let the truth you've spent 4 months building do the work it was built to do. That's what justice actually is, in my experience. Not a moment. Not a door slamming, not a face falling. It's a process that grinds forward on its own weight once you set it in motion. And the best thing you can do, once you've done your part, is get out of its way. I walked out of the courthouse. The cold hit me immediately. Sharp December air, the sky the particular pale gray of a winter afternoon. Diane and Marcus came through the doors behind me, and we stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, not talking, just breathing. Then Marcus said, "I need coffee, and I need it immediately." Diane laughed. A real laugh, short and sudden. The laugh of someone who has been professional for 8 hours straight and has just been given permission to stop. I smiled. It surprised me. The ease of it, after everything. "All right," I said. "Let's get some coffee." We walked down the courthouse steps into the gray December afternoon, and somewhere in the city behind me, a legal proceeding that had been built to erase me had just been used instead to document exactly what I was, which was not a man in decline, not a man who had lost his grip on himself or his affairs or his judgment, just a man who had been lied to by someone he loved, had looked at the evidence and had refused to pretend it said something different than what it said. That's all any of us can do in the end. Look at what's in front of us clearly and refuse to flinch. The coffee at the diner 3 blocks from the courthouse went cold while Diane was still talking. We had been sitting in the back booth for nearly 2 hours, Diane, Marcus, and me, and the waitress had refilled our cups twice without being asked, the way good diner waitresses do when they can read a table and understand that what's happening there is not casual. Outside the window, the December afternoon had gone fully dark. The courthouse was still lit across the street, its upper windows yellow against the black sky. "The criminal referral is already with Priya Nair's office," Diane said, her hands wrapped around her cup. "She has everything Raymond compiled. She has the authenticated emails. She has Judge Holloway's findings." She paused. "She's going to move." "Timeline?" I asked. 6 weeks? Maybe 8? Priya doesn't sit on things." Marcus was quieter than usual, which with Marcus meant he was thinking hard about something he wasn't ready to say yet. I had learned his rhythms over the past months. The way his silence had a different quality when he was processing versus when he was withholding. This was withholding. "Say it," I told him. He looked up. "The estate," he said. "We need to talk about the estate." I had known this was coming. I had been holding it at a slight distance all day, the way you hold something that requires a particular kind of attention and you haven't had the space to give it yet. The morning had been entirely consumed by the hearing, but the hearing was over now, and what remained, the 4.7 acres in Hanover County, the house, the private mortgage that Meridian Capital Partners was entitled to call in, was not resolved by Judge Holloway's ruling. The ruling had protected my assets and invalidated the guardianship scheme. It had not returned to the property. "Walk me through it," I said. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "The private mortgage is in default. 1 payment missed 3 weeks ago. Meridian has the contractual right to initiate foreclosure. If they do, the property sells at auction, the proceeds go to Meridian first, then any remaining creditors, and whatever is left, if anything, goes to Ethan and Vanessa as the current title holders." "How much is left after Meridian?" Raymond's latest estimate puts the net somewhere between 300 and 400,000, depending on auction price. Which sounds like a number until you realize that Ethan and Vanessa's remaining debt, the credit cards, the personal loans, the business account balances, totals somewhere north of 600,000. I absorbed that. So they walk away from the auction with nothing, I said. Less than nothing. The debt doesn't disappear at auction. It follows them. I looked at my cold coffee. And the first refusal clause? Marcus glanced at Diane, who gave him the slight nod that meant go ahead. The transfer documents contain a clause, he said, that gives the original grantor, you, the right of first refusal if the property is ever threatened by foreclosure or third-party debt action during the grantor's lifetime. It's a standard protective clause in estate transfers. Most people never need it. He paused. You need it. Can we exercise it given the criminal proceedings? That's actually an argument in our favor, not against us, Marcus said. The private mortgage was taken on in the context of a fraudulent scheme that specifically targeted you. The circuit court's findings today document that. We argue that the debt was incurred in bad faith, that the first refusal clause exists precisely to protect against this scenario, and we file to exercise it before Meridian pulls the foreclosure trigger. How fast can you file? I can have the motion drafted by end of week. I looked at him. Do it. He nodded once and pulled out his phone to make a note. Across the table, Diane let out a slow breath. Not dramatic, just the specific exhale of a person who has been carrying a great deal of tension and has just been given permission to put a portion of it down. There's one more thing, she said, and her tone shifted in the way I had learned to pay attention to. The shift that meant what she was about to say was the part she'd been building toward. Ethan, I said. Ethan. She held my gaze. Coates is going to withdraw. He can't represent both of them anymore. Their interests are completely divergent now. Vanessa's going to fight the criminal charges with everything she has. Ethan, she paused. Ethan has a decision to make about whether he follows her into a trial or whether he cooperates. What does cooperation look like? It looks like testimony about the planning conversations, about what he knew and when, in exchange for reduced exposure, probation rather than incarceration, most likely. She was careful with her next words. His testimony would strengthen the criminal case against Vanessa considerably. The table was quiet. I understood what she was not quite saying directly, that my son cooperating with the prosecution meant my son testifying against his wife, that it meant choosing, finally and publicly and on the record, something other than the path Vanessa had laid out, that it meant, in a way that no private letter or voicemail could accomplish, actually facing what he had been part of. That's his decision, I said, not mine. I know that, Diane said. I just wanted you to have the full picture. I picked up my cold coffee and drank it anyway, because it was there, and because the bitterness of it felt appropriate for the moment. The call I had not expected came 11 days later. Not from Ethan, not from Vanessa's new attorney. She had retained a woman named Dana Farrell, who had already sent Diane a letter that Diane had described as aggressive in the specific way of attorneys who know they're holding a losing hand and are trying to establish volume as a substitute for evidence. The call came from Gerald Coates. He called Diane, not me, which was the correct protocol, and Diane relayed it to me that same evening. Coates had formally withdrawn from representing Vanessa, citing conflict of interest, as we'd anticipated. He was continuing to represent Ethan, and he was, off the record, in the careful phrasing of an attorney communicating something significant without committing it to writing, indicating that his client was prepared to cooperate with the DA's office. How complete? I asked Diane. Complete, she said. Coates used the word comprehensive. He's a precise man. He chose that word deliberately. I sat with that for a long moment. Comprehensive meant Ethan was going to tell Priya Nair everything. The planning conversations, the timeline, the specific decisions he'd been part of, and the specific things Vanessa had told him that he'd accepted, or not questioned, or actively assisted. It meant the full interior of a marriage I had never been permitted to see was going to be opened up and examined under the unforgiving light of a criminal proceeding. It meant my son was going to tell the truth, for possibly the first time in a long time, to people who had the authority to use it. I did not feel triumphant about that. I want to say that clearly. There is a version of the story where the father receives news that his son is cooperating against the woman who manipulated him and feels a surge of vindication, of the particular satisfaction of being right about someone you warned your child about years ago. I did not feel that. What I felt was something heavier and less comfortable than vindication, something closer to sorrow, not for what was happening, but for the distance between who Ethan had been at 9 years old and who he had become at 39. For how a person travels that distance without appearing to notice the direction they're heading until they have arrived somewhere they can't easily leave. "Nathan," Diane said, when the silence on my end had lasted long enough that she felt the need to check. "Are you all right?" "I'm thinking," I said. "Okay." "He's doing the right thing," I said finally. "Late, but he's doing it." "Yes," she said. "That doesn't fix anything." "No," she said, "it doesn't." We sat in that honest silence for a moment, the silence of two people who have known each other long enough to not fill space with false comfort. "It's something, though," I said. "It's something," she agreed. Vanessa's trial began in the third week of March, on a Monday that arrived gray and cold with a late-season threat of snow that didn't materialize. I did not attend. I had made that decision weeks in advance, deliberately, and I did not second-guess it. My presence in that courtroom was not required and was not useful, and the act of sitting in a gallery watching a proceeding that had already been decided by the evidence was not something I needed for my own resolution. What I needed, I had found, was simpler and less dramatic than being present at Vanessa's public unraveling. What I needed was to go to the cemetery on the Monday that her trial began and stand beside Patricia's grave in the late winter cold and tell her, out loud, that the house was coming back. I drove out on Monday morning. The cemetery was quiet in the way cemeteries are in winter, stripped of the softening that summer greenery provides, everything honest and bare. The oak near Patricia's grave had dropped all its leaves months ago and stood in the particular elegant starkness of a deciduous tree in March, every branch visible, the whole architecture of it exposed. I stood there for a while. I told her about Marisol and what Marisol had done. I told her about Diane and Marcus and Raymond. I told her about the December hearing and Judge Holloway and the specific moment when Raymond had said $147,000, and I had watched Ethan's head come up and the look that had passed across his face. I told her that Ethan was cooperating. I said it out loud because it was the hardest thing to say and the most important. The wind moved through the bare oak branches above me. The cold was clean and direct, the way March cold is. I drove home. Marcus gave me daily summaries of the trial's progress. Not transcripts. Diane had access to those, but we both understood I didn't need to read every word. Marcus distilled what testimony had been presented, how it had landed, how Farrell's defense was holding up against the weight of what was in front of it. The answer, consistently, was not well. Ethan's testimony came on the third day. Marcus called me that evening, and I could hear in his voice the specific quality of someone who has witnessed something in a courtroom that he will remember for a long time. "He was thorough," Marcus said. "Coates prepared him well. He answered what was asked, didn't elaborate beyond the question, didn't perform remorse in a way that would have looked calculated. He just answered. What happened? When? What he knew." "How did Farrell cross-examine?" "She tried to establish that he'd been coerced, that Vanessa had manipulated him into participating in something he didn't fully understand." A pause. "He didn't give her that." "What do you mean?" "She asked him, at one point, whether he'd felt pressured by his wife to go along with the plan. And he said, 'I'm going from notes here.' He said, 'I made choices. I was a grown man. What she did that I didn't know about, that's on her. What I agreed to, that's on me. I'm not going to sit here and say I didn't understand what we were doing." I closed my eyes briefly. "The jury saw that," Marcus said quietly. "Whatever happens with his own proceeding, the jury saw him say that in that courtroom." I thanked him and put down the phone and sat for a long time in my apartment, in the March dark, with the window cracked slightly and the cold coming in the way I'd gotten used to preferring, the reminder that the outside world was still there, still moving, still indifferent to the particular difficulties of any individual life in the way that weather is always indifferent, and that I had come to find oddly comforting rather than alienating. My son had sat in a witness chair and refused to make himself smaller than he was. Had refused, when given a clean exit, to use it. Had said, "I made choices." It was not enough. Nothing that had happened in a courtroom was going to be enough in the sense of restoring what had been lost or undoing what had been done. But it was true. And truth, even when it arrives late, even when it costs the person telling it considerably, has a weight that cannot be faked. I had spent 31 years in rooms where people tried to fake it. I knew the difference. God. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. Guilty on all 3 counts. Diane called within minutes. Her voice had the settled quality it got when she had worked very hard for something. And the work had produced what it should have produced. Not elation, because Diane's relationship to outcomes was always more complicated than elation, but resolution. The cord landing. "All 3?" I said. "Unanimous on 1 and 3. 10-2 on count 2. A pause. "Sentencing in 8 weeks. Priya is pushing for the upper range." "Sinclair took a plea last week, 2 counts. His bar license is already suspended." She paused. "It's done, Nathan. The criminal piece. It's done." I stood at the window of my apartment. I had moved back to my own place in December, the week after the circuit court hearing, because the hotel had served its purpose and served it well, and I was ready to sleep in my own bed again. And I looked out at the March city. The street below was wet from afternoon rain. The lights were coming on in the buildings across the way, one by one, the ordinary evening sequence of a city going from work to home. I thought about the first night, the hotel room off I-95, the industrial cleaning product smell, the interstate sound through the thin curtain, the way I had sat on the edge of the bed and decided that the only thing available to me was the next thing, and the next, and the one after that. I thought about Marisol running across the dark gravel toward my car. "Diane," I said, "thank you for all of it, for answering the phone at 11:30 on a Saturday and never once making me feel like what I was asking was more than you could carry." A brief silence. Diane, deflecting sincerity, "You paid me well." "Not well enough." "No," she said, with a small warmth in it. "Probably not." Mom. Ethan's plea came 4 weeks after the verdict. 1 count of conspiracy. Cooperation formally noted. The DA recommended probation and community service, no incarceration, subject to Judge Tully's approval. I was not present. I received the news from Marcus, who had attended as an observer. "How was he?" I asked. Marcus considered the question with the care it deserved. He looked like someone who had arrived somewhere he needed to arrive and was not comfortable about it and wasn't pretending to be. He paused. "That's the best I can say." It was enough. It was actually exactly what I would have wanted to see if I had been there. The financial consequences moved quickly after that. Ethan's consulting license was suspended pending review. A review that Diane told me honestly was unlikely to resolve in his favor for several years, if at all. The marriage was already on paper in the process of dissolution. Vanessa had filed before the verdict came in, which told me something about the specific quality of her self-preservation instinct that I found grimly clarifying. Their shared accounts were frozen, then released in the legal sequencing of the criminal proceedings' financial penalties. The restitution order, $147,000, the precise amount of the private account transfers to be paid to Ethan as a secondary victim of Vanessa's financial deception within the marriage, was ironic in a way that I suspected no one involved found particularly amusing. Sentencing came in late March. Vanessa received 2 years federal, 3 years probation following release. She stood for it with the same composure she had maintained throughout, which I knew only from Marcus's account because I had not been present. When the sentence was read and the bailiff moved toward her, she apparently looked once at the gallery, a single brief survey, found no one she was looking for, and looked away. Ethan received 3 years probation, community service, no incarceration. I was told this by Diane on a Tuesday morning while I was drinking coffee at my kitchen table with the newspaper open in front of me and the March light coming in sideways through the east-facing window, the way it does in the last weeks before the clocks change. I put down my coffee. I looked at the light on the table for a moment. "Nathan," Diane said, "the estate motion is moving. Marcus expects the filing to be accepted within the week. Meridian isn't going to fight it. Raymond flagged their own regulatory issues to the right people, and they want a clean exit more than they want a prolonged legal battle." "How long until the deed transfers?" 4 to 6 weeks, maybe less. I did the math without meaning to. Late April, early May. The oak trees along the driveway would be in new leaf by then. The garden that Patricia had planted along the front walk would be coming back from winter, the perennials pushing through whether anyone had tended them or not, the way perennials do, patient, persistent, returning without being asked. "Diane," I said, "when it transfers, when the deed is recorded, will you call me immediately?" "The second it's confirmed," she said. "I'll call you myself." I thanked her and put down the phone. Outside the window, the March morning was doing what March mornings do in Virginia, cycling through 3 different weathers in the space of an hour, sun and cloud and a brief scatter of rain that passed before you could decide whether to find an umbrella. Indeterminate, between things, not winter anymore, not yet spring, suspended in the particular uncertainty of a season that hasn't committed. I understood that feeling intimately. I was not done. The deed hadn't transferred yet. Ethan's 3-year probation was going to be 3 years of whatever it was going to be. I didn't know, couldn't know, was trying not to construct expectations about it, because expectations were what had walked me down that driveway in October and nearly into the middle of a trap. And the wound that this whole year had opened in me was not the kind that closes cleanly. It closes the way real wounds close, slowly, with scar tissue, leaving something different in its place than what was there before. But the criminal proceedings were done. The verdict was on record. The conspiracy that had been built with such patience and precision over 14 months, in emails and private meetings, and a dinner invitation sent to a father who had been waiting 2 years for exactly that call, all of it had been used in the end not to destroy me but to document permanently and publicly exactly what had been attempted and by whom. The trap had become the evidence had become the case, and the case had become a ruling, and then a verdict, and then a sentence. And somewhere in the machinery of all that consequence, the house at the end of the long oak-lined driveway was making its way back to the name it should have stayed in all along. I got up from the kitchen table. I rinsed my cup. I put on my coat and went for a walk in the uncertain March morning, through the neighborhood I had lived in for years, and that had held me through the hardest months of this. And I walked for a long time without any particular destination, just moving, just being present in the ordinary, difficult, beautiful fact of a day that was mine. That was enough. That, I had learned, was actually quite a lot. Diane called on a Wednesday morning in late April, at 8:47, while I was standing at the kitchen sink rinsing a coffee cup. "It's recorded," she said. "The deed transferred this morning. The county confirmed it 20 minutes ago." A pause. Brief, but the kind that holds something in it. "Nathan, it's yours again." I stood at the sink with the water still running and the cup in my hand, and I did not say anything for a moment. Not because I didn't have words, because the words that existed for that moment were not the efficient kind. They were the kind that belong to the space between a man and his own life, and they don't travel well over a phone line. "Thank you," I finally said, "for everything, for all of it." "Go see the house," Diane said. And then, because she is Diane and cannot sustain sentiment for more than 10 consecutive seconds without deflecting it, "and call me if there are any complications with Meridian's exit paperwork. I don't expect there will be, but call me anyway." I turned off the water. I set down the cup. I went to get my keys. The drive to Hanover County took 40 minutes in the Wednesday morning traffic, and I did not play the radio. I just drove. Past the neighborhoods I knew and the stretch of highway where the landscape opened up and the sky got bigger, past the turnoff that I had taken hundreds of times over 32 years, until I stopped taking it and then taken again in the dark on an October evening that had been the beginning of everything that followed. The oak trees along the driveway were in full leaf. That stopped me for a second. The sheer fullness of them, the deep late April green against the pale morning sky. I had planted those trees as saplings 32 years ago, and I had watched them grow through all the seasons of a life, and they had kept growing through the seasons I hadn't been here to see. They did not know what had happened in the house at the end of their corridor. They had simply kept becoming what they were. I drove slowly under them, gravel under the tires, the particular sound of it. The house was quiet and slightly unkempt in the way of a place that has been in legal transition. Ethan and Vanessa's furniture was still inside, which would need to be addressed, and the garden along the front walk was overgrown and tangled from a winter nobody had tended it through. The paint on the south-facing trim was peeling in 2 places. There were things wrong with it. There were things wrong with everything that has been through something real. I parked and sat for a moment with the engine off. Then I got out and walked up to the front door and I put my key in the lock. The same key, the one I had kept in the drawer of my apartment through all of it, and I opened the door. The house was cold inside. Stale air, closed up cold, the smell of absence. I stood in the entry hall and looked straight through to the back windows and the yard beyond them, the same sight line I had loved from the beginning, the one that made the house feel like it breathed. I walked through to the back porch and opened the door and stood there looking out at the yard. Overgrown. The garden bed along the fence completely wild. But the apple tree Patricia had planted in the corner was still there, still leaning slightly east the way it always had, new leaves coming in thick and healthy. It had not needed anyone's attention to survive the winter. It had simply survived. I stayed for an hour, walked through every room, took inventory not with a clipboard but with my eyes and my memory. What needed work, what was sound, what had been altered, and what was unchanged. The bones were good. The bones were what I had built, and the bones held. When I left, I stopped at the end of the driveway and looked back at the house through the rear view mirror. It sat at the end of the oak corridor the way it had always sat, a little imperfect, a little worn, absolutely itself. I drove home and called Marisol. She came the following Saturday with her daughter Elena and a level of organizational energy that I had learned over the months of knowing her in this new context not to interfere with. They moved through the house for 2 full days. They opened windows and scrubbed floors and cleared the wild tangle from Patricia's garden bed with a thoroughness that bordered on the ceremonial. Elena, who had her mother's directness and a sharper sense of humor, held up a particularly gnarled root at one point and said, "What is this?" "I have no idea," I said honestly. "Neither does it," she said, and dropped it in the yard waste bag. By Sunday evening, the house was clean. Not restored. That would take months, the paint, and the landscaping, and the slow business of making a space feel inhabited again rather than reclaimed. But clean, honest. The smell of stale absence was gone, replaced by cleaning products and April air, and something underneath both of those that I can only describe as the house returning to itself. I paid Marisol 3 times her rate, as I had told her I would. She argued with me briefly in the way she argued, not performance, genuine discomfort at what she considered excess. And then she accepted it because I told her plainly that what she had done on an October evening in the dark was not something I could compensate, and that this was not an attempt to. It was simply what it was. She looked at me for a moment. "Your wife would have liked how this turned out," she said. I thought about Patricia, about her garden coming back in the bed along the front walk, about the apple tree she'd planted that had kept growing without her. "Yes," I said, "she would have." The letter from Ethan arrived in May, on a Thursday, in the mailbox at the end of the driveway. I saw his handwriting on the envelope, the slightly cramped cursive I recognized from birthday cards when he was young, and I stood at the mailbox for a moment with the morning air moving through the oak trees around me. Then I took it inside and poured coffee and sat at the kitchen table and opened it. It was long, 4 pages, front and back, written at what I somehow knew was a kitchen table, probably late, in the way that hard things get written. When the day is done and the defenses are tired and the truth is easier to reach than it is in the managed hours of daylight. He admitted everything. Not legally. The legal admissions were already on record. Personally. The decision to follow Vanessa's plan when the money got bad enough that desperation replaced judgment. The 2 years of silence that he described, with a bluntness that cost him something to write, as the longest sustained act of cowardice of his life. The dinner invitation, the specific evening, the fact that he had written that text, just family, knowing exactly what it was, and sent it anyway. And then the thing that had apparently broken something open in him in a way that nothing else had. Sitting in the courtroom in December and hearing Raymond say $147,000 transferred into a private account. Money moved without his knowledge, by the woman he had chosen over everyone and everything else, into a personal account she had apparently been building as her own exit while they were supposedly partners in a plan. He wrote, "I helped plan something terrible, and I didn't even know the full extent of what I was planning. I've spent months trying to decide which is worse. I don't have an answer. They're both failure, just different shapes." He did not ask for forgiveness. That was the thing that mattered most. The letter did not position its honesty as currency to be exchanged for something. Near the end, he wrote, "I'm not writing because I expect anything. I'm writing because what I did requires being said directly, to you, in words you can hold. I'm sorry, Dad. I know that's not enough. I just needed you to have it." I read it twice. Then I folded it and put it in the drawer of the desk in the room I'd turned into a study. Not to dismiss it, to give it a place, to acknowledge that it existed and mattered and was not nothing, while also not pretending it closed what it couldn't close yet. Some distances don't close because someone decides to close them. They close, if they close, in the slow accumulation of choices made differently, one at a time, over time, without guarantee. I was not ready to call him. I understood that about myself clearly enough not to force it. But I also understood, sitting at that kitchen table in the May morning with the sound of the garden crew working outside, that not being ready was not the same as never. That the drawer I'd put the letter in was not a door I was locking. It was a place I could come back to when I was ready to take the next step. That had to be enough for now. And on June, I hired the landscape company. I gave them Patricia's notebook, the one with her garden sketches, 32 years old, the pages slightly yellowed but the handwriting as clear as the day she'd made them. The designer, a young woman who held the notebook with both hands and read it with the particular focus of someone recognizing good work, said she knew what she was doing. She knew what she was doing in most things, I said. The replanning took 3 weeks. I worked alongside the crew some mornings, not because I was required to, but because there was something in it I needed. The physical directness of putting something in the ground and watering it and coming back the next day to see it slightly more established than the day before. Patricia had always said that gardens teach patience better than anything because they don't respond to impatience. They respond to time and consistency and appropriate conditions. They cannot be hurried. I thought about that a great deal in June. The letter I wrote back to Ethan took me 3 weeks, not because I didn't know what to say. I knew the shape of it from early on, but the shape kept changing as I sat with it. Too cold, too forgiving, too efficient. The thing resisted being written quickly, which I understood eventually was the correct response. Some things should resist being written quickly. The final version was 2 pages, handwritten, mailed on a Tuesday morning in August. I told him I had read his letter many times, that it mattered, not as resolution, not as restoration, but as evidence of something I had not been certain still existed, the capacity to look at what you've done without softening it. I told him about the house, about Marisol and Elena, and the 2-day cleaning operation, about Patricia's garden coming back, about the apple tree that still leaned east. I told him I did not yet know what was possible between us, that I was not closing anything and not opening anything prematurely either, that some doors require more time than we think they should, and forcing them before they're ready breaks the frame. And then I told him the thing that had taken the longest to find words for, that the people who had been truly present through everything, the people who had showed up, done the work, told me the truth when it cost them something. None of them were connected to me by blood. Diane, Marcus, Raymond, Marisol. They had chosen to be present. Nobody had obligated them. They had looked at the situation and decided, each in their own way, that being there mattered more than the risk of being there. That, I wrote, is what I now understand family to mean. Not the people who share your last name. Not the people who owe you connection by accident of birth. The people who come running out of a side door in the dark, because what they know is more important than what it might cost them to tell you. That's the definition. And I had been slow to understand it, and the slowness had cost me, and I was telling him because I thought he needed to hear it too. I wrote, "I don't know if you and I can build something like that. The foundation has to be rebuilt from different materials than what we were using before. But I know it can't be built with silence. You broke the silence. That's something. What we do with it is still to be determined." I sealed it, mailed it, stood at the post office counter for a moment after handing it across, the way you stand when something has left your hands that cannot be recalled. Then I walked out into the August heat and drove home. I want to tell you where I am now. Not as a tidy ending. My life is not tidy, and I would not trust a version of this story that pretended otherwise, but as an honest account of what survives. I am 69 years old. I live in this house, the one I built 32 years ago and recovered at a cost I am still, in some ways, still calculating. The garden is imperfect, partially established, several of the new plantings still tentative in the soil. The trim on the south side has been repainted. The gravel on the driveway has been topped. The inside of the house is mine again, in the way that spaces become yours over time. Not because you own the deed, but because your habits have settled into the rooms and the light knows where to find you in the morning. Marisol comes on Saturday mornings. Not as an employee, I am her client in the new cleaning business she started in June, and I pay her accordingly, and we have coffee at the kitchen table and talk about nothing in particular and something important simultaneously, which is the best kind of conversation. Elena stops by sometimes, unannounced, which she has apparently decided is acceptable. It is. Ethan and I have spoken twice on the phone since I mailed the August letter. Short conversations. Careful. With the specific quality of two people relearning the sound of each other's voices after a long time of not hearing them. Not comfortable, not resolved, but happening. He is living in a smaller apartment on the west side of the city, working in a hardware store while the consulting license question works itself through the review process that Diane tells me will probably not end in his favor for at least another year. He sounds, in those brief phone calls, like a man who is doing the hard and unglamorous work of becoming someone he can tolerate being. That is not a small thing. That is, actually, one of the most difficult things a person can do. Vanessa is serving her sentence. She has not contacted me, and I do not expect she will. There are people whose capacity for genuine accountability I have simply stopped waiting to discover, and the energy that releasing that expectation freed up has been put to better use. Howard Sinclair's law license has been permanently revoked. He is the subject of civil action from two other clients whose situations Raymond identified as sharing certain structural similarities to mine. The machinery of consequence, once set in motion, tends to find things. What I want to say to you, and I'm saying it to you directly now, the way this kind of story earns the right to do at its end, is this. I was a man who had spent 31 years presiding over other people's disasters. I had seen, from an elevated position, the full range of what human beings are capable of doing to each other in the name of money and fear and the specific desperation that comes from watching a life you've built begin to come apart. I thought I understood it. I thought the professional familiarity with human capacity for harm had given me a kind of protection, an immunization. It had not. When the harm came from my own son, it was exactly as devastating as if I had never seen the inside of a courtroom. Maybe more so, because I understood precisely what was being done to me and could not stop the feeling of it by naming it. Understanding betrayal intellectually does not make it hurt less. It just makes you a more articulate witness to your own pain. What I want you to take from this, if you are sitting with your own version of this story, if you are the person who has given and given and given and watched it be taken, if you are the one who opened a door in good faith and found a trap behind it, is that the capacity to fight back is not dependent on being extraordinary. It is dependent on being willing to see clearly, to look at the evidence in front of you without the softening that love sometimes demands, and that loyalty sometimes provides, and that desperation always tries to manufacture. To say, this is what this is, not what I wish it were, not what it was before, what it is right now in front of me, documented and undeniable. You are allowed to see clearly. You are allowed to act on what you see. You're allowed to protect what is yours: your home, your money, your name, your dignity, your right to exist in this world on your own terms, without apologizing for the protection. The fact that the person trying to take those things from you is someone you love does not obligate you to let them succeed. Love is not a contract that requires you to surrender your life as the price of maintaining it. And you are allowed to choose your family, not only the one you were born into, but the one you build. The Marisols who come running in the dark, the Dianes who pick up the phone at 11:30 on a Saturday, the Raymonds who follow the money without flinching, the Marcuses who attend your hearings because they understand that the outcome matters to a person, not just a case. Those people are family. The blood ones who choose to stay and choose to be honest and choose you over and over again, they can be family too. But the choosing is the thing, the showing up is the thing, not the name on the birth certificate. The house is quiet this morning. October again. A year from the evening that started all of it. And the oak trees along the driveway are turning, red and gold at the edges, the leaves catching the low morning light the way they do in October, the way they have done every October for 32 years, indifferent to everything that has passed beneath them. I sit on the back porch with my coffee and I look at Patricia's garden, at the apple tree leaning east, at the yard where my son used to run in the summer dark catching fireflies in a jar back when the distance between who he was and who he would become was not yet visible. I do not know what Ethan and I will build. I know it will be slow. I know it will require both of us to do things that do not come easily. I know there will be days when the distance seems too wide and the history too heavy, and the question of whether it's worth the effort genuinely unanswerable. But I'm still here, in this house, with this coffee, with this October light on the oak trees that I planted when they were young and that have become, over 32 years, something substantial and enduring and entirely their own. I survived being betrayed by someone I loved without becoming someone I don't recognize, without hardening into bitterness, without letting the worst thing that happened to me become the defining thing about me. I held on to the work and the truth, and the people who chose to stand with me, and I let the process do what it was built to do. That is not a small victory. In fact, I have come to understand it is the only one that matters, not what you defeat, what you manage to remain. I finish my coffee. The October morning is moving toward its middle now, the light shifting, the yard coming into its full morning color. Inside somewhere, a door moves in a draft from the window I left open. The house is breathing. I am still in it. That is enough. That is finally and completely enough.